Great. So hard bottom subtidal communities. So you have either sand that can be on the bottom in this coastal ocean, or you have like rocks and stuff that can be underwater in this area. And if it's rocks, you've got a hard bottom subtidal community. And typically, those rocks and stuff are really just an extension of the land out into the water, the rocks and stuff that are on land into the water. But sometimes it can be made up of other things like worm tubes or like oysters and stuff like that. Bless you. One of the things that you can find in the coastal ocean on a hard bottom type of substrate is a kelp forest. Okay, so that would occur in a temperate and subpolar region. Okay, so you get kelp forests occurring in temperate and subpolar regions. And so the reason why they're found in temperate and subpolar regions is because kelp must be in water that averages less than 20 degrees Celsius. So what was the average temperature that we needed for coral to be in? Greater than 20 degrees Celsius. So kelp must be in water that is less than 20 degrees Celsius. So we find coral reefs in hard bottom substrates in the tropics, and then we find kelp forests in hard bottom substrates in the temperate and subpolar regions. So everywhere that's in color on this map, the red, the green, and the blue, that's where you can find kelp forests. Okay. Notice there's some areas, like right here by Chile off the coast of South America, and then like down here on the northern part of Africa, where like, and on our coast, right, where some of this color kind of like leaks down like into lower latitudes than you would think it would. Yeah. So remember last semester when we talked about gyres and currents, okay, and the gyres are the big like whole ocean basin currents. So these gyres get started by the trade winds, and they move cold water from the poles and they move it towards the tropics, and they take the warm water from the tropics and they move it towards the poles. So this whole like gyre thing is actually what's going to be pulling some of this colder water up the coast of like South America or like down our coast and allowing for kelp forests to live in these areas. It's one of the factors. Okay. You also get like upwelling and stuff that occurs here because of, yeah, lots of trade winds and stuff. But that's one of the things that will affect it. All right. So you get kelp forests on hard bottom substrates in temperate and subpolar regions, and definitely not in the tropics. Okay, so kelp, you have different types of kelp forests depending on where you are on Earth. So different kinds of kelp will form kelp forests depending on where you are on Earth. So if you are in like Asiatic areas or in the North Atlantic, you're going to have a type of kelp called laminara. That's this picture on the left. Okay, that is going to be the type of kelp that will form the kelp forest. But if you're off our coast, okay, or you're going to see like Macrocystis, which is the picture right here. That's the giant kelp. Okay, it's called giant kelp. And that's the type of kelp that will form kelp forests on our coast. All right, so depending on where you are, you'll have different kinds of kelp that will grow. And as you can see, they're very different. And so you're going to get different kinds of communities that can live in these two areas. See that? Okay, so let's look at what kelp absolutely must have in order to grow and to survive. Kelp absolutely must have a hard place to attach to. It has to have a rock to attach to. Even if that means that it's like a rock that's surrounded by sand, it has to have a rock. So it must have a hard place to attach to. It also must be in cold water, averaging less than 20 degrees Celsius. And it also must be in water that is very nutrient rich. Okay? Very nutrient rich. So lots of nutrients, cold water, and a hard surface to attach to. All right. So these kelp will attach to the hard surface, and then they start to grow. And when they grow, they actually form two kind of like divisions in the kelp forest, or two kind of like general habitats. You have the canopy and the understory. The canopy is made up of the big giant kelp, and it's the top part, and I'll kind of show you a drawing here in a minute. And then the understory is everything underneath that. So you have your canopy up here. You notice it's like all this macrocystis, like super thick, okay, lots of kelp up here. And then all of this down here, this is the understory, okay? And in this area, you're going to find things like seagrasses in those in the sand that might be around the rocks where the kelp are. You're also going to find like a lot of red algae. Red algae likes to live here, and other types of algae as well. But for the most part, the canopy will be made out of the macrocystis, and then you'll have other types of algae living down here. Okay, so here's what happens. Kelp will attach to a surface like a rock, okay, and it's got to hold fast, right? It doesn't have roots, so it's got has to have a hard surface to attach to. So it attaches to a surface and it starts to grow. Okay? And it goes up towards the surface of the water, and then once it reaches the surface of the water, it keeps growing. But kelp doesn't have, support structures, and so it doesn't like grow up and out of the water and like stick out of the water. It keeps growing, but it lays on the surface of the water. Okay, so when you get a bunch of these kelp fronds all growing next to each other, they keep growing on the top of the water. They all kind of like lay out on the top of the water and create this thick canopy at the surface. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the understory down here is going to be a little bit more open space. All right. So that canopy up there will have different things living in it than the understory down here. And just like a tropical rainforest, right? The tropical rainforest has a canopy and, understory, same thing with the kelp forest, just in the ocean. Okay, so these kelp forests are going to create lots of different habitats for different things to live. So they can live in all sorts of different areas on the kelp, in the holdfast of the kelp, in the water column around the kelp, on the rock next to the kelp, many different places. So in the holdfast of the kelp, you'll actually get, you can get hundreds of animals that can actually live in a single holdfast of the kelp. It's kind of crazy. Types of things that you would find here, you would find things like brittle stars, little crabs, worms, isopods. Okay, they're all going to live here in the holdfast of the kelp. And they live there because it's a very protected place. The kelp has this kind of like tangle of a holdfast, and they can get into those cracks and crevices and hide from predators. On the rocks that surround the algae, or that the kelp are attached to, you can get things attached to the rocks and living on the rocks around it. So you'll get things like sea stars, sea urchins, sponges, lots of different things. Abalone, lobster, anemones that will be living on the rocks around the kelp. You can actually get things that live on the kelp itself. Okay, if the things that live on the kelp itself are called epiphytes. Okay, so they're living on the surface of the kelp, and I'll show you some pictures of these. But bryozoans, I'll show you a picture and you can see what they look like. Live on the surface of the kelp. You have the kelp crab, the kelp limpet, and top snails. Okay, bunch of different kinds of snails that will actually live on the surface of the kelp itself. And then if you have like rocks and those rocks are surrounded by sand, you can actually get different things that will live in the sand that surrounds the rocks. So you can have seagrasses, but you can also get all sorts of like fish and anemones and snails and clams that will live there as well. Okay, so lots of different areas. Here's a few pictures. So right here on the upper left, okay, these are like the arms of brittle stars that are sticking out of the holdfast of the kelp. This is like a feather duster worm sticking its gills out. You can kind of see like the yellow stuff right there. That's the holdfast of the kelp. Over here, see these white things? Okay, these are bryozoans. This is a up-close picture of a bryozoan. And then see this picture right here? It's like kind of, the kelp kind of looks fuzzy. Okay, those are actually the bryozoans on the kelp. Okay, so you get things that actually live on the surface of the kelp. And then we've got our isopod, okay, our kelp limpet, and our kelp crab. Okay, so all of those things live on the surface of the kelp. And then these guys live in the holdfast. Okay, so you also have fish that will live here. But the fish are mainly going to live in the water column, so like in that understory area. Okay, you can have lots of different kinds of fish. The Garibaldi, the big orange one, that's the California state fish. Okay, you'll find lots of those in kelp forests. So fish in the water column, and also mammals. The types of mammals that you'll see are things like sea otters and like harbor seals, and the California sea lion can also be in here. Okay, so those are the types of mammals that you would see. You don't really see birds, particularly like in the understory of the kelp forest, because birds, in order to capture the fish, they'd have to dive down underneath the canopy to catch the fish, and then when they would try and come back up through the canopy, they get entangled in all of like the fronds of the kelp, and they would drown. So you don't really get birds in a kelp forest like diving down into the understory. So they may sit on top and eat anything that's on top, but they're not going to like dive down. Okay? So in that water column, in the understory, you get mostly fish and mammals. And pictures, so you can see a bunch of different kinds of fish, and then, you know, your sea otter, which is also the keystone species of a kelp forest, right? We learned that. And then harbor seal over here. Okay, so why do kelp forests matter to us? Well, they matter for a variety of reasons. They matter for the animals that live there because it's their habitat, and it provides protection for them and a place to live and a source of food. But for us, it matters because the kelp actually helps to slow down waves before they reach shore, and helps to like reduce the impact of the waves on the shoreline. And so that'll help protect like your house if you live on the shore. It also provides protection for migrating mothers. So gray whales and their calves will migrate every year, and killer whales like to hunt baby gray whales, and because they're very vulnerable. All right, they may be big, but they're not super strong and like good at swimming yet. So they will be hunted by killer whales. And what the mother gray whales will do is they'll actually swim in between a kelp forest and the open ocean to kind of like try and hide from the killer whales. So you've got like the shoreline, some space, and then the kelp forest, and then the open ocean. They'll swim in that space. So that essentially just allows for them to, you know, kind of like hide from the killer whales. They're not as obvious to the killer whales. So the kelp forest help to protect baby gray whales. Good. Bless you. We also get a lot of commercial value from kelp forests in terms of like the species that we harvest from there, like abalone or lobster or urchin. Okay, but remember last semester when we talked about like the 3 products that we extract from algae, agar, algin, and carrageenan? Bless you. Those are the 3 products, and I passed around in class the different things, and we looked at like the types of kelp products that were in food. Yeah, we get kelp products from kelp to put in food, like ice cream, and everybody loves ice cream because it's delicious. So that's one of the things that we get. Kelp forests are also valuable because of tourism. So it's really fun to go and like kayak on a kelp forest because you can see lots of things, like, you know, harbor seals and sea otters and stuff like that. So I highly recommend it. It's pretty fun. Also, diving's pretty cool too because again, there's a lot of things to see. So do it. It's cool. Okay, so how many of you have heard of El Nino? Yeah. Okay, so El Nino, Southern Californians know El Nino as like the years that we get a lot of rain, and we like that. Okay. Kelp forests see El Nino as like death, pretty much. So El Nino actually causes a lot of problems for kelp forests. And let me explain what happens in an El Nino event, and then we can talk about like why that affects kelp forests. Okay. So remember, we have winds that get formed in the atmosphere by the uneven heating of the earth by the sun, and you get these big strong winds, particularly at the equator. The trade winds are the most constant winds on earth. And so normally you get these trade winds that are blowing, and they're actually blowing the water that's over by us, okay, or over by like Chile and Peru and South America. And they take all of that surface water that's normally there that's warm, and they blow it over towards the other side of the Pacific, okay, over towards Indonesia and Australia, over there, okay? So normally that's what's happening, okay? The wind is blowing all of that surface water over. And as it blows that warm surface water over, that helps to draw water up from the deep, right? It helps to create this like cold water, nutrient-rich upwelling on our coast, okay? That's normal. What happens in an El Nino event, we don't really know why, it tends to happen approximately every 4 years or so. These winds break down. No idea why. So they break down, and all of this warm water that's normally getting pushed over to this side of the ocean sloshes back across the Pacific and like comes back over to our side. Okay, so we bring warm water over to where it's not normally. Okay, and that causes a lot of problems for kelp forests. Okay, so kelp likes cold water. All right, and when they're not in cold water, that's bad for them. This picture here, before I switch the slide, is just to kind of help you see the sea surface temperature. So notice how like normally all the red and orange is like over here, close to Australia and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. And then in an El Nino event, look at where it is, over by us. Okay? So warm water by us, which affects the kelp. Right? So kelp likes cold water, and El Nino brings warm water. So when kelp are in warm water, they get weakened. So just like you, if you don't sleep, you know, very much for a long time, like you're doing lots of schoolwork and stuff like that. So just like you get weakened physically when you're, you know, stressed and stuff, kelp get weakened physically by being in warm water. Okay, so they get weakened. That makes them more vulnerable to disease, just like you're more vulnerable to getting sick when you're, you know, tired and stressed out. They are also more vulnerable to disease. They're also more likely to be uprooted by storms because they're weaker. So when the storms come from El Nino, because we get lots of storms from El Nino, those kelp are more likely to get pulled up and uprooted. So what happens is, because they get weakened and sick and stuff, we actually get a distribution decrease in kelp forests during El Nino. So the amount of kelp forest actually decreases during that time. And sometimes if it's really severe, you can actually get a switch from a kelp forest to an urchin barren state, okay, because so much of the kelp gets destroyed and pulled up. So you can actually get, you know, your other alternative stable state can occur because of El Nino. And what's also interesting is normally you kind of have like a mix like around us of like fish that come up from the south and fish that come down from the north. We kind of have a combination of both of those types of fish in our kelp forests. But in El Nino, because you get warmer water, you get some more of like the southern fish that come up and push out some of the northern fish. And so you get more southern fish in the community. And then there is a thing called La Nina that actually brings colder water. And in that case, you get northern fish that come down and kind of like push out the southern fish. So the actual makeup of the community will alter depending on the temperature of the water, which is kind of interesting. So, okay, so that's the types of things that you'd find in the hard bottom substrates in the coastal ocean, right? Coral reefs, which we talked about, found in the tropics, kelp forests, found in temperate and subpolar regions. But now we need to look at, bless you, we need to look at the water that is above the continental shelf, right? There's actually animals that just live their entire life in that water above the continental shelf, okay? And we actually have a name for that. It's actually its own habitat. It's called the neritic zone, okay, the neritic zone. So let me scroll down so you can see this. So this is like our continental shelf, right? This right here This is going to be the water above the continental shelf. That's the neritic zone. Okay, out in the open ocean, not over the continental shelf, this is going to be called the oceanic zone. Okay, that'll be the oceanic. This is the neritic. All right, so this is the place we're looking at right now. So in the neritic zone, you have lots of nutrients, you have lots of sunlight, so you get lots of phytoplankton. Okay, lots and lots of phytoplankton. And because you have lots of phytoplankton, that means that you can have a large zooplankton population. And actually, the most abundant type of zooplankton that you find here are copepods. Right? Do you remember last semester you guys drew copepods? You looked at them under the microscope. They're like the little bugs, yeah? Okay, so copepods live here. And then you have like benthic filter feeders that will be eating the phytoplankton. You also get like small fish that eat the zooplankton and then bigger fish that eat those fish. Okay, so that's in general what's going on here. You actually have fewer trophic levels here than you do in the open ocean because there's lots of abundant food. So this picture right here actually represents the trophic levels in the neritic zone and it's kind of weird, right? Notice, what do you notice about this trophic pyramid? It's very pyramid-like? No. It's kind of like the Jamba Juice sign, yes. So in order to have this many primary consumers, how many primary producers would you have to have? Yeah, like a ton, right? So this green bar right here should extend way far out on both sides, but it's like less than the primary consumers. So like, how does that work, right? You're supposed to, only 10% of the energy gets passed on, so this is strange. So here's what happens actually. You get what we call a standing crop of phytoplankton, okay? Standing crop of phytoplankton. So that's kind of like, on average, how many, phytoplankton are there, okay? Every day, when the sun comes out, because there's so many nutrients and so much light in this area, you get the phytoplankton just like grow really, really fast, divide very quickly in this area. And so every day you get like this huge increase in the number of phytoplankton. But because there's so many things that live here and they eat so much of the phytoplankton, they eat pretty much all of that, reproduction that those phytoplankton do every day. And so you actually get a bunch of primary producers, the phytoplankton, that reproduce a lot every day. And then because there's so many of them, you can support a lot of primary consumers, which can support the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. So we have this like little bar for the primary producers that represents kind of like the standing stock, and then every day they reproduce and produce way, 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 way more. Does that make sense? Okay. So how much phytoplankton can be produced in the neritic zone will be affected by upwelling, right? So if you have upwelling, you'll get even more nutrients, which means even more phytoplankton, which means even more animals. And then this neritic zone is going to be important for different animals, particularly like sessile creatures will spend part of their life as plankton, okay, in the neritic zone. Okay, so there'll be meroplankton in the neritic zone. Okay, and that allows for these sessile creatures to disperse to other places. So that's one of the reasons why it's important.